Okay, so I'm delighted to introduce Katie Maras, the Senior Lecturer in Psychology at Bath University in the UK and Deputy Director of the Centre for Applied Autism Research at Bath. Katie's research interests lie in applied psychology with two main strands, one being autism and the other being eyewitnesses and forensic psychology. Her current work focuses on how autistic adults think and communicate differently and what adaptations service providers can make to accommodate those differences. Katie has published numerous papers on a variety of topics concerning autism. This includes assessing credibility of autistic witnesses by jurors and how to improve current police interview strategies to produce better evidence. Her research shows that current police interviewing techniques do not elicit best evidence from autistic individuals, and that interviewers need to adapt their questioning styles in order to obtain detailed, relevant, and accurate information about an event from autistic people. Whilst Katie is talking to us today from the UK, she has spent some time in Australia previously, and Katie worked at a camel farm during her time here, and she undertook a 4-week trek across the Simpson Desert, which is quite an achievement. So I'd like to thank you, Katie, for joining us today to share with us this really important area of study and discuss the evidence-based approaches to effective interviewing of people with autism. So if you want to share your screen with us, Katie, that would be great.
Right. Okay, thank you very much, Harriet, and thank you for inviting me to give this talk. It's a real pleasure. So I'm going to be talking about evidence-based best practice for interviewing autistic individuals. I became interested in this initially from a memory perspective, and then talking to a professor who is researching memory in autism, who was explaining to me how autistic people have very specific memory difficulties, and we talked about how it'd be very interesting to see how that transpires in an applied setting like the criminal justice system. So that's kind of where my starting point was. So in this talk, I'm going to start by talking about why an autistic person might be the focus of an investigation, for example, in the criminal justice system, but also investigations in other contexts such as the workplace. I'll then give an overview of how differences in autistic cognition mean that traditional police interviewing models, which are developed for neurotypical individuals, are often inappropriate for autistic people. And then I'll outline attempts to adapt interviewing techniques with varying success for autistic witnesses. And the last part of my talk will briefly consider remaining challenges, such as issues around diagnosis, disclosure and credibility, and application for suspects and defendants, since most of the work to date has been around interviewing witnesses, as well as further afield in areas such as employment interviews. So first of all, why might an autistic person be the focus of an investigation? Well, we know that autistic people are more likely to encounter the criminal justice system. A recent study suggested that as many as 20% of autistic youth have been stopped and questioned by police in an 18-month period alone. Sadly, autistic people experience high rates of victimisation across a range of crimes, from hate crime, exploitation, robbery, theft, vandalism, assault, abuse, and so forth. And regarding offending, there's a kind of mixed pattern. There's a multitude of reasons that have been linked to an increase in offending for certain types of crimes, such as crimes against the person, anything from kind of sexual offences to assault. And reasons for this have been suggested, such as difficulty engaging social interactions and reading others' intentions and their emotions, circumscribed interests and behaviours, misinterpreting rules, and not recognising the consequences of one's actions, alongside challenging behaviours and issues with impulse control and emotional dysregulation. And these factors alone are rarely enough to cause an individual to engage in criminal behaviour, but often when coupled with precipitating factors such as underlying family issues or a sudden deterioration in mental health, disruption to routine, or stress or sensory overload, can result in certain types of offences. However, there's also evidence that autistic people are actually less likely to engage in other types of crime, such as property crime, driving and drug offences, and cybercrime. So, for example, there's a widely reported link between autism and cybercrime, but actually that's not really borne out by the evidence. So once you've controlled for higher IT skills in the autistic population, there's some evidence that autistic people are actually potentially less likely to engage in cybercrime. And other studies have shown that autism may actually serve as a protective factor in certain types of offending, and actually it's comorbid diagnoses such as ADHD that can lead to offending. So I just kind of want to highlight that there is some evidence suggesting that autistic people are more likely to engage in certain types of offences, and there's kind of underlying reasons for that, but there's also evidence that they're less likely to engage in other offences. So it's a kind of messy picture, if you like. But also autistic people may be involved in investigations for other reasons as well, such as just witnessing an event or alerting the attention of police or the authorities for apparently appearing potentially suspicious, but actually it's just autistic behaviours and not actually engaging in any wrongdoing. So the overrepresentation of autism in the criminal justice system also links to the type of behaviour that may lead to problems in workplaces, such as stress claims and other non-compliant behaviour. And from a witness perspective, any employee may be a witness and have difficulty communicating with an investigator as a witness or respondent. So autism may impact upon a person's ability to provide evidence in a number of different ways. So when we think about what is required in an interview, there's a number of aspects which are particularly challenging for an autistic person. So an interview, well, obviously, language and communication is the currency of an investigation, really, if you're being in an interview situation. Autistic people have specific difficulties with language and communication. So questions may be interpreted very literally. So questions like, I'm going to jog your memory or draw your own conclusions, which a non-autistic person will automatically kind of know what they mean, but a non-autistic person might be quite kind of baffled by this sort of question. And also questions that are posed as statements, such as, Ben told you he was home all evening. A non-autistic person would naturally go on to correct that if it was wrong or agree with it, but to a non-autistic person, that doesn't necessarily require a response. So they may not elaborate on those kind of questions that are posed as statements. Also, we find that receptive language can be diminished in autism, and sometimes also expressive language. So an interview also requires social cognition. The interviewee needs to think about what the interviewer knows already, how much they want to know, what types of details they want to know, when to start reporting and at what point to stop reporting, and what types of details and this sort of thing. All of this is quite demanding cognitively in order to hold this information online and consider another person, i.e. the interviewer's thoughts, expectations and listening needs. An interview also relies on executive functions, so holding information about the event in your mind whilst also attending to questions, some of which may be potentially quite long-winded and complicated. Episodic memory, of course, you're recalling a past personally experienced event, and I'll come on to this in more detail in a moment, but autistic people experience specific difficulties with their memory. In communicating your memory to an interviewer, you need to pull it together in a kind of narrative form and explain the relations among the actors and things that happen in the story. And again, this is another area of difficulty for an autistic person. Again, another issue is what we call metacognitive monitoring. So keeping track of what details you remember and how well you remember them. So it's reporting an event requires a series of kind of online decision making, which you might not necessarily notice that you're doing, but every detail is monitored for how certain you are that that detail actually happened. And then you have a certain criterion whereby you decide whether or not to report it or not. So this is what we call metacognitive monitoring, and this can be another issue for autistic people. And then finally, the environment and situation is likely to be quite stressful. It's certainly going to be unusual, potentially very high stakes situation. It may be in a new environment where there may be sensory issues and other factors that most people would find quite stressful, but particularly an autistic person. So we need to consider all of these factors and make appropriate adaptations in order to support an autistic person to provide their best evidence. So all of these things together are going to lead to stress unless they're appropriately supported. So just a bit of background about memory in autism. So if we think about memory in terms of semantic memory and episodic memory, so semantic memory is memory for timeless information such as facts, capital cities and so forth, but also facts about one's own past. Semantic memory in autism is unimpaired. So autistic people do not, once you've taken any accompanying intellectual impairment out of the equation, autistic people have good semantic memory. But we find specific difficulties in episodic memory. So memories for past, specific, personally experienced events. So if we think of an episodic memory as being bound by a number of different types of details, these contextual details, who was there, what happened, where was it, when was it, and so forth. And all of these components of a memory need to be marked in order to then be recalled as one coherent bound episode. We find autistic people process and recall items of information or aspects from their past, but not in the whole bound episode. So for example, they might remember that their colleague John has moved to a new department and he has a new role in whatever it is, but they might not remember when or where they learned that information, that it was 3 Tuesdays ago by the water cooler at lunchtime or something. And as a result, they can have difficulties in monitoring the source of information, source monitoring difficulties. And there's been a number of reasons posited as to why this might be in things like kind of binding information together in coding or difficulty retrieving it all together. But crucially, the task support hypothesis, which was posited by Dermot Bowler and colleagues quite a while ago, suggests that if you provide more support for autistic people in recalling information, they can recall as much as their non-autistic counterparts. So whereas free recall, so just tell me everything that happened, or in a more kind of experimental lab-based setting, it would be tell me all the words that you saw at study time. That's a free recall task, and autistic people tend to recall fewer details on this type of test. When you give them a cued recall test, so you give them more prompts for, okay, there was items of fruit on the, can you tell me an item of fruit that was on the list of words that you learned? Their recall improves. And when you give them a recognition task, so a yes, no, was this here, when you studied it, they actually recall as much as non-autistic people. So this is pretty important because it suggests that the difficulties are to do with retrieval and not encoding. So when we think about interviewing and listing best evidence, this is encouraging because it suggests that actually if you just tweak the way that you're interviewing an autistic person, you can get as much information from them as a non-autistic person, but you do need to adapt what you do in order to retrieve that information. So let's have a look at how effective current interviewing methods are for an autistic person. So the cognitive interview, just to recap, I'm sure most people know this already, is one of the most widely researched police interviewing techniques that's also used in other settings as well. It's based on sound psychological principles about memory retrieval. One of the main ones is context reinstatement. So this is where if you reinstate the contextual details that was experienced when you witnessed an event, when you come to recall it, you can recall more information. So in this classic study from the 1970s, they got deep sea divers to learn lists of words either underwater or on land, and then recall the list of words either back underwater again or back on land. So it either matched or mismatched with the context in which they learned it. And if they had a match, then they could recall more details. Now, obviously, you can't really do that in a police interview, but what you can do instead is get the witness to mentally travel back in time. So thinking very carefully, focusing really hard on all the contextual details, what the weather was like, who they were with, all the things that led up to the event and so forth, to kind of mentally put them back in that context, and then they can recall more details. The cognitive interview also utilises multiple and varied retrieval. So this is based on the assumption that memories are stored as a series of interconnected nodes, and you can access a single memory in a number of different ways. And if you try a different route in, you can trigger sometimes extra details. So, for example, recalling the same event again, but backwards or from a bird's eye perspective. And also utilising social communication techniques, so building up rapport with the witness, transferring control of the interview to the witness so that they can control the pace, and the language is very much witness compatible based on how they're describing things and so forth. So the cognitive interview has been shown in hundreds of studies to be a really effective method of eliciting more details, often more accurately, from a range of witnesses, from typical adults to elderly witnesses, and in modified forms to children, and even, again, if it's modified to some extent with witnesses with intellectual disabilities. For autistic witnesses, however, it's not so effective. And in fact, if you think about the task support hypothesis, that if you provide more support for an autistic person at test, they can recall more details. This is quite surprising on the face of it. So if you look at the non-autistic witnesses, this is the typical effect you find with a cognitive interview. They recall more details than with a standard comparison interview. The autistic witnesses, they recalled a similar number of details, correct details, regardless of how they were interviewed. So the cognitive interview is more time consuming to conduct. So obviously you don't want to be wasting time as an investigator conducting this lengthy interview if it doesn't elicit more correct details. But importantly, it actually increases the number of errors that autistic witnesses report. So not only is it a waste of time, it's also actually detrimental to the evidence that you obtain from them. So that's a fairly kind of key point, that the cognitive interview, at least in its sort of standard form, is not an appropriate method to interview autistic witnesses. So this is interesting. I mean, I'm interested in it theoretically because it's kind of it's got a number of implications theoretically, but also practically, of course. We need to know, well, why it doesn't elicit more details in order to then develop an interview technique that does elicit more details from an autistic witness. So the self-administered interview is basically a kind of cognitive interview in pen and paper form, developed for situations in which there are multiple witnesses to an event. It could be anything from a terrorist attack to a road traffic collision where there's loads of witnesses and it's not clear who's going to be a priority witness, and you want to get a good quality retrieval attempt before memory starts to decay. And it includes cognitive interview techniques such as context reinstatement. So here the witness, rather than following a series of verbal instructions from an interviewer to think about, to put themselves back in time, they read a series of instructions in the booklet. And it also contains the report all instructions, so report all details, no matter how small or trivial they may seem, which is also a key component of the cognitive interview. So crucially, though, it doesn't have any social component, of course, because it's a self-administered written interview. So we wanted to look at the self-administered interview for autistic witnesses to see if maybe once you've just taken that social component out, because obviously autism is a condition marked by social communication difficulties, whether the self-administered interview is useful in eliciting more details from them. So the context reinstatement procedure of the self-administered interview basically elicits similar results to the regular context reinstatement procedure. That is, for non-autistic witnesses, it increases the number of correct details they recall. For autistic witnesses, it doesn't have any effect. So even in a written form, context reinstatement isn't much use. So as I said, it's kind of interesting theoretically, but also practically. And we need to think about whether this is an encoding or a retrieval issue as to why the cognitive interview isn't working. Because if a witness isn't even encoding, an autistic witness isn't even encoding event details with the context they experienced at the time, then any interview technique that then tries to take them back to reinstate the context is going to be completely futile. So thinking about whether it's an encoding or retrieval issue is obviously important. So there's several lines of evidence that suggest it's actually a retrieval rather than an encoding issue. So we know that autistic people have difficulty with executive function, so holding lots of information mentally kind of online, and working memory. So the report all instruction requires a witness to conjure up all of their memories for an event, but they've got to hold that online whilst they're reporting all of it. And it's quite cognitively burdensome in order to do that. It also relies on emotional imagination. So with context reinstatement, you're asking a witness to go back in time to remember how they were feeling. Again, that's something that autistic people can find difficult. And we know that while autistic people show diminished free recall of contextual details, and without going into a lot of detail, this is from kind of very basic lab-based experimental tasks, they do show undiminished recognition of contextual details. So if you ask them to freely recall things that they didn't really realise they were processing at the time, they don't recall so much. But if you give them a recognition test and say, was this there when you saw the information start at study, they will be able to recognise it. And again, although autistic people have difficulties monitoring the source of their memories, so where or when they learn something, as in line with the task support hypothesis, if you provide them more support, such as in cued recall or recognition, they can recall more. So that does suggest that potentially the issues with the cognitive interview and context reinstatement are more of a retrieval issue. And perhaps if we continue to look for ways to tweak these interviews, we might be able to elicit more details from an autistic witness. So one way we tested this is by looking at physical context reinstatement. So perhaps we thought it's the actual series of following a series of instructions, whether it's from an interviewer in real time or whether it's from a booklet, is just not getting at that context. It's not putting an autistic witness back in the context for some reason. So we looked at whether actually if you physically put them back in the context, whether that does boost their memory. So we ran the traditional context reinstatement, mental context reinstatement procedure, but either in a different room from which they witnessed the event, as this sort of standard eyewitness experimental practice, or we returned them to the same room in which they witnessed the event. So then that's actually physically putting them back in the room. So the blue bars are the usual verbal context reinstatement procedure, showing that the autistic group's recall was less complete than that of non-autistic witnesses. But when we returned them to the same room, then there's no difference now between autistic and non-autistic witnesses. So that's really positive because it's showing that actually they can benefit from retrieval techniques such as this, and physically being back in the context can be beneficial. So of course, it's obviously not practical sometimes or actually desirable to return witnesses to the scene of the crime. And then there's issues as well with things like repeated events. It's not going to be an appropriate technique. So we still need to find alternative methods of task support. The standard structure for witness interviewing in the UK is to start with free recall and then ask questions based on what the witness has already said. So free recall is the kind of gold standard starting point, an exhaustive free recall attempt, and then you can slowly narrow that down more and more on questioning based on what the witness has already said. However, as I've kind of hopefully illustrated, free recall is problematic for autistic witnesses. Sometimes it's less complete, particularly for certain types of details relating to people and actions. Often it's less specific. So this is relating to a particular instance, so recalling contextual details, which obviously is a kind of key thing you want to get in an investigation, is that specific instance with all the contextual detail around it. Sometimes their free recall is less accurate, particularly in monitoring the source of information, such as the who, the what, the where, and the when. And sometimes it's less relevant as well. So free recall, tell me everything, don't leave anything out, can be very problematic for an autistic witness who can find it difficult to determine what's relevant and then produce an account that is coherent and is clearly kind of causal for a naive listener to kind of figure out the order and causation of events and things that happened. So we've sort of tried to test lots of different methods for improving specificity, the completeness of recall and accuracy. So I'll go through some of these techniques now. So in this study recently, we tested out lots of different methods of questioning. So we tried open questions. So tell me about the last time you went to a bank. We tried what we called semantic support. So this was a kind of open prompt, but preceded by something that would orient the witness to that, to think about the question more semantically. So do you normally bank online, or do you normally go into the bank? Do you go into the bank often? And then tell me about the last time you went into the bank. So you're kind of going in from a sort of almost like a top-down route. And then visual verbal prompting. So this is where the witness is prompted specifically for tell me about the last time you went to the bank, tell me about when this was, the people that were there, the actions that happened, the setting, and any objects that were there. And they get this kind of printout of like this pie chart with the when, people, action, setting, and object, and they can use either their finger or a coin to kind of go around it and make sure they've kind of covered each of those elements as they recall their answer. And we found, and we looked at this across different types of different contexts, so criminal justice system, healthcare, and job interview context. I've just collapsed the data here for simplicity, but we found that only visual verbal prompting, so this specific prompting, was effective. It was effective for both groups actually, so the autistic and the non-autistic witnesses, in eliciting more specific details. So this is the kind of rich contextual information that really pinpoints to that specific instance in time, and is not just a sort of a overgeneral response. So that's obviously what you want to try and get at in an investigation, is that specific instance information. So a technique such as visual verbal prompting can be quite useful. In another study by a group at Cambridge, they looked at different question types with children, autistic children, and they categorized their questions. They called them slightly different things, but invitations. So this is what I would call kind of more of a free recall. So tell me everything that happened from the beginning to the end. Cued invitations, so this is a bit narrower but still fairly open, refocusing their attention on previously mentioned details and then using them as contextual details. So for example, you mentioned that there were two men exchanging something, tell me more about that. And then getting more and more close, so directive questions like who drove the car, and then option posing prompts such as was the door open or closed. And they found that the cued invitations, so these ones that were refocusing the child's attention on something they'd already mentioned, like narrowing the parameters, but still keeping it fairly open, were the most effective for the autistic child witnesses. So it's quite clear then that more prompts and questions, so this is, more cued recall, is effective, and the most effective way of eliciting more specific and more information from an autistic witness. The problem with that in an investigation is you can't do that from the outset. You need free recall first. So within a legal framework, it's not appropriate. It would be seen as leading the witness, but also in terms of actually obtaining evidence, it limits completeness if you go straight in with a question. You need to get the free recall first. And then also, it's got issues with sort of suggestibility and compliance. So while autistic people without intellectual disability are not more suggestible, so they're not more likely to alter their memory, that what they believe happened, they may be more compliant, they may be more likely to go along with an interviewer's suggestion for kind of more compliance reasons. So it's important to not go in with questions from the outset. So we need to think about what alternative techniques could be used at the outset. So if an exhaustive free recall account can be cognitively burdensome for an autistic witness, it can lead to less relevant information, less specific information, less complete information, less accurate information. We do need a different technique to get information at the outset that doesn't lead and is fits kind of within a legal framework. So I spent quite a few years talking to police about the research that I've just mentioned and telling them what doesn't work, and that's great, but what does work? And I was getting fed up with saying I don't know. So it's nice to have been finally able to come up with a technique that is actually effective. So this is the witness aimed first account, or what we call WAFA. So here, rather than going in with a free recall, an exhaustive free recall that starts with along the lines of tell me absolutely everything, don't leave anything out, instead, the witness generates their own discrete parameter-bound topics of the event. So they basically segment the event up, but very briefly. So this might happen by, for example, the interviewer saying, okay, think about what happened yesterday or in the park, or whatever the broader parameter is. Tell me the most important thing that happened. And the witness might say, oh, well, there was a fight between two guys. And so the interviewer would be, great, okay. And they'll write that down on a Post-it note, put it on the wall or wherever, so that both the witness and the interviewer can see it. That's great, thank you very much. Tell me something else that happened. And they'll go, oh, well, just before that, there was a guy and a girl that went into the shop and they were on the phone and something else. Okay, great. And you write that down and so forth until you've got however many segments that basically breaks up that event into the component parts. So then you've got that, and it's on the Post-it notes. You've got them all in these little parameter-bound topic boxes then. And then you can go in and freely recall, ask them to freely recall as much as they possibly can. So you're asking them to generate that report all exhaustive free recall attempt, but within each of the individual topic boxes. So the parameters are now very much narrowed. So you're kind of supporting or you're alleviating the cognitive burden of doing this very, very broad free recall. So they can focus their retrieval attempts on each of the individual boxes. And then that can be followed by probing, the kind of the traditional sort of open, going to more specific questions, but within each of the topic boxes in turn. So this would be compatible with the way that autistic people remember and recall events, because it's still witness-led. So the WAFA technique elicits more correct details from both autistic and non-autistic witnesses, about 15% more correct information. And it also improves accuracy for both groups. So this can be a really useful technique that can be adapted depending on the context that you're interviewing in, the type of event you're interviewing in. But it's, as I said, it's witness-led. It alleviates demands on executive functions, social cognition, and allows the witness to generate their own retrieval search, but within more narrower and more explicit parameters. So there are other techniques as well that could be used in combination with WAFA, or depending on the event, to elicit more details about a certain aspect of it. One of these is sketching. So Michelle Mattison and colleagues have used sketching as a form of reinstating context with autistic children and adolescents. So they are kind of given some context reinstatement instruction, but asked to kind of sketch in order to help them to remember the event. So that improved the accuracy of autistic children's accounts, but it didn't improve the number of correct details they recalled. We looked at sketching within the self-administered interview, because there's a sketching component of the self-administered interview, and that did improve the number of correct details, but they were still not as many as correct details as the non-autistic witnesses. So I think it can be useful, but it's probably not as effective just by itself. It probably needs to be incorporated into other interview techniques as well. And then finally, another option, which needs further examination, but is to use more remote forms of interviewing to relieve the social cognitive burden, which is obviously particularly pertinent in the current times that we're in. So recalling an event is not all about accuracy or informativeness. It's actually a trade-off between the two. you've got to kind of monitor each detail that a witness monitors each detail that they report for both informativeness, so how fine-grained is that information or how detailed is it, but also how certain they are of the accuracy of it. And there is this sort of trade-off and balance between the two. So we looked at this across 3 phases of questioning, varying the instructions that were given to witnesses to either maximise accuracy or to maximise informativeness. And we also varied the conditions in which the questions were delivered. So they were delivered either socially in a normal interview, face-to-face context, or online. So both autistic and non-autistic participants showed a tendency to prioritise informativeness at the expense of accuracy to produce more fine-grained answers, and that's a kind of a fairly robust finding. But both groups' accuracy improved when they were given the instruction to maximise accuracy over informativeness. So, okay, now only report details if you're absolutely certain that they're correct. So then both groups then became more accurate but less informative. Interestingly, both groups also were more accurate in the social condition, in the face-to-face condition, which is kind of somewhat surprising for the autistic group. However, when we ran a more kind of fine-grained analysis of this, so we looked at their reporting control. So this is like a fine-grained analysis of their decisions about when to withhold and when to put forward their fine-grained answers, depending on whether they were accurate or not in the previous round of questioning. That's when we saw a difference in the social condition. So in the social condition, the autistic witnesses showed poorer reporting control. So they weren't making optimal grain size, accuracy, informativeness trade-off decisions in the social condition. So, as I said, this needs more investigation, but I think provisionally it suggests that potentially, not necessarily being completely online, but potentially making the interview situation almost quasi non-social. So just removing the kind of obvious social demands. So perhaps that could be anything as subtle as just rather than face-to-face seating, you might want to think about having a 90-degree angle on seating. So you're just removing that demand to maintain eye contact, and other things that you can do perhaps, or potentially online, but again it needs a little bit more investigation as to how that might be effective, because there was another study as well that looked at questioning with an avatar, and on the initial results suggested that both autistic and non-autistic witnesses were more accurate when they were interviewed live, but when they conducted again a more fine-grained analysis and more kind of nuanced analysis, it was suggesting that actually the avatar was potentially better for the autistic witnesses. So you might just, as I said, want to think about how the kind of social burden can be reduced in an interview, particularly for an autistic witness. Okay, so I just wanted to briefly mention the witness intermediary scheme here we have here in the UK, which I don't think you have in Australia, but it can be useful potentially. You might want to think about having somebody who is a speech and language expert, or somebody at least who knows the individual well. So what I've to support the interview. So the research I've showed you so far has been very much based on group performance. And really, autistic witnesses, there's huge heterogeneity amongst autistic participants in the studies. And an individualized, more tailored approach is best. And whether that can be carried out by the interviewer or investigating team themselves, or calling in someone who is more expert to get that type of information and advise, is worth thinking about. So in the UK, intermediaries they're normally not. They have a kind of their day job as a speech and language communication specialist, and then they're called upon for vulnerable witnesses in order to assist and facilitate communication between an interviewer and the interviewee. So quite often they will conduct background assessments of the interviewee, assess their level of communication, their IQ, how well they'll be able to handle certain questions and any adaptations that might be needed. and then advise the interviewing officers on how best to proceed. And they sit in on the interviews as well. And so where an officer becomes, or an interviewer sort of starts asking questions that are not going to be well understood by the interviewee, or the interviewer's getting tired, even if it's something as simple as they just need a break, they're there to kind of assist with that in order to obtain best evidence. So it's really worth thinking about if there's any potential to get that kind of assistance in order to adapt the approach that you take based on a more on the individual that you're actually going to be interviewing. So although we've developed new interviewing techniques such as the WAFA technique to better support autistic people provide the best evidence, there's still a number of remaining challenges. A reoccurring issue surrounds diagnosis disclosure. So the implication is that adaptations are of limited value unless police or an interviewer knows that the person they're about to interview is autistic. I just want to make two key points here. So first of all, if you adapt your interview technique, this will quite often benefit everybody, not just autistic witnesses. So making questions more explicit, narrowing the parameters, but within a non-leading or non-constraining way, is beneficial for non-autistic witnesses as well. So that there's certainly no harm done, but it's also likely to be beneficial regardless of whether they're autistic or not. And then the second point is that we found in one of our studies that many autistic people are reluctant to disclose their diagnosis in an investigative context. So disclosure is obviously a very personal choice, but it's usually necessary in order to trigger adaptations to be made. So although if you make an adaptation and the witness isn't autistic, that doesn't matter, that's potentially still a good thing. To trigger the adaptation in the first place, you probably need to know that the person is vulnerable or autistic or requires particular support or adjustments. And so they need to know that disclosing their diagnosis is important in order to trigger these adaptations, but also that they wouldn't be discriminated against for doing so. So when we've asked people why they haven't disclosed their diagnosis in investigative settings, quite often we get answers about feeling like they'd be discriminated against, although they didn't feel it was relevant to the early stage of investigation, or that their diagnosis would devalue their evidence. So we've run a couple of studies looking at the effect of diagnosis disclosure on how they're perceived as witnesses. And actually what we find, so we've taken testimony where we've obtained from a previous eyewitness experiment of autistic and non-autistic witnesses recalling an event, shown them to mock jurors or mock investigators, and asked them to rate their credibility. And half of them, we've told them that they're autistic and given them some information about what autism is and how it affects a person. And the other half, we didn't tell them anything about the autistic people. We didn't say that they had autism or anything. And what we find is that when perceivers are given information that a person's autistic and what autism is and how it affects the person, they're perceived as more credible as witnesses. We've also looked at this in the context of defendants using a vignette setup. So we describe a hypothetical defendant called Mr. Parsons, who was behaving aggressively at a train station, and when police officers tried to restrain him with handcuffs, he became violent and struck an officer. So we've based this on real life examples of the sorts of situations that autistic people can sometimes find themselves in, and then alongside diagnostic criteria, which included things like aggressive behaviours that were reactive to high stress, an invasion of personal space, and disruption to routine, which were all brought about following the defendant's pursuit of his circumscribed interests in trains. And then we followed this by a short excerpt of the defendant's behaviour interviewed in court, such as he displayed high levels of anxiety and intolerance of uncertainty, alongside impaired social communication, poor eye contact, sensory sensitivities, restrictive and repetitive behaviours, and a need for sameness. And again, for half of the participants, we told them that he was autistic and the way that his autism affected him, and the other half of participants, we gave them no information at all. And here the differences in how he was perceived are really quite striking. So where the participants were given information about his diagnosis, they perceived him as more honest, more likable, and less blameworthy for his actions. And when we asked them whether he was guilty or not, even though it was quite clear that he did assault a police officer, actually, when they were given diagnosis information about him, they were much more likely to find him not guilty than if they were given no information. So that just kind of illustrates the importance of, for the autistic community, in disclosing the diagnosis. If they feel like they're going to be discriminated against or perceived negatively, then actually quite the reverse is true. But also it's important to think about how an autistic person might come across if you don't know that they're autistic, that they might actually be perceived as less credible because some of the autistic manifestations of behaviours might be perceived more negatively. So it's important to know that a person's autistic in order to understand the differences that in the way that they might be perceived. So the research I've talked about has been mainly focused on witnesses, victims' witnesses. There's no experimental research at the moment that's been published on the best way to interview autistic suspects. So obviously you want to obtain a complete and accurate and relevant account. So that's where the witness interviewing techniques still apply as standard, but techniques that are designed to detect deception, such as those that try to maximize cognitive load and task difficulty on the basis that lying is more cognitively demanding than truth telling. So if you maximize cognitive load, then that sort of triggers cues to deception, if you like, may be very problematic for an autistic person and may result in them being perceived as potentially being deceptive when in fact they're just being autistic and actually finding the demands of this social high stakes situation quite very demanding. And then when you impose more cognitive demands in order to try and trigger cues to deception, then they just kind of, you know, sort of may fall apart and be almost unable to provide any decent evidence and may be perceived as being deceptive as a result. So that's a kind of just sort of theoretical at the moment, but Ralph Bagnall is doing a PhD in this area at the moment, so quite exciting. He's in his second year, so hopefully should have some findings coming out in the next year or so about how autistic suspects are perceived and the effectiveness of these suspect interviewing techniques for them. So that's a kind of just space to watch. So just to wrap up, so challenges for investigators when interviewing an autistic witness is to think about flexible interviewing first of all. So one size does not fit all. Rethinking traditional models, so starting with this very open free recall with an exhaustive retrieval attempt needs rethinking. And also environmental adjustments. So, you know, thinking about a kind of quite more quasi-social and thinking about how sensory issues as well can be alleviated. So thinking about the environment in which the person is interviewed. It's important to try and facilitate diagnosis disclosure in order to make adaptations and not misattribute autistic behaviours. I've not really touched upon this in this talk, but thinking about interviewer training that's role specific as well. So how an interviewer is going to be interviewing an autistic person is not just going to be based on general autism awareness training. It needs to be quite sort of specific to the role. Thinking about registered intermediaries or how a professional can be drawn upon to tailor the approach that you take when interviewing an autistic person. And thinking about future research as well. So we need more research, particularly with less verbally and intellectually individuals, particularly with suspects, and particularly in other questioning contexts outside of the criminal justice system. So the techniques that I've talked about, so making the demands more explicit, narrowing the parameters, alleviating the burden on executive functions and social cognition also apply in other areas such as an employment or recruitment interview, for example. So rather than sort of saying, you know, tell me a bit about yourself as sort of standard recruitment interview question, making it more explicit. So first I'm going to ask you to give me a short introduction to yourself. what are your best personal characteristics, what are your educational qualifications, and what work experience do you have? So that again benefits not only an autistic person, but also a non-autistic person. It levels the playing field a bit as well. And these techniques can also be used in other settings like healthcare and clinical settings, particularly the WAFA technique. So segmenting an event up in order to then explore those topic areas in turn can be adapted into different types of settings as well. Okay, so I think I'll finish there, and thank you very much for listening, and thank you to all of my collaborators and my funders for funding this research.
That's lovely. Thank you very much, Katie. And I think you've just turned your slide share off, so that's great. So that was an absolutely fascinating presentation covering all those issues. And because we're pre-recording this session, I'm going to ask, just raise a few questions with you, and I'm sure those participants that listen to this presentation will come back with some more questions that, because there was so much material and ground covered in that talk. But clearly, listening to all that, everything that you've just said, clearly the key issue is around how to be more specific in your questioning without asking leading questions or without, preempting the responses that you're going to get. And there's, some of the research that you've done has provided, some really good examples of how that may be done. But I'm curious to know whether you've done any work with sort of pre-interview interviews, so where the interviewer may be speaking to their witness or indeed their suspect to gauge their communication capabilities, particularly where disclosure of a diagnosis is not there, or even indeed where there is no formal diagnosis, because many people with autism, particularly adults, don't have a diagnosis because nobody thought to do that when they were younger. So yeah, have you done any work on that area, sort of with the pre-assessment?
No, it's an area that's it's kind of a bit of a minefield really in terms of researching, and also then how do you actually address this issue as well. A lot, like you say, a lot of autistic people aren't diagnosed and receive a diagnosis as a result of going through the criminal justice system. It's normally quite a late stage, like, court sort of stage, or sometimes even prison. But I think addressing the individual that you've got in front of you is really important. So whether they're autistic or not, it might become apparent they've got social communication difficulty. Trying to gauge the extent to that, and then what you need to do to adapt your interview techniques is pretty key, I think. Like you say, regardless of whether they're autistic or not, if they've got social communication difficulties, then you need to do something differently. And if it's making your questions more explicit, you can try and gather that information from a witness beforehand. But yeah, I think it's an area that would be really interesting to look at, and it's a bit tricky to disentangle, I think, as well.
Yes, yeah. And it sort of leads into the role of intermediaries, because I know some of the police departments in Australia have been trialling the role of intermediaries, and they're very tightly controlled process in the criminal justice system. But if your interviewing is done outside of the criminal justice system in a more administrative role, there's no barriers at all to using a professional who has expertise in this area of communication skills to assist the investigation and make that process easier. So I think certainly that our listeners that come from that more civil investigation space, it's worth noting that there's nothing that says you can't use an expert if it's managed in the right way and doesn't interfere with the interview process but helps it, then it can only be a good thing.
That'd be a real advantage for sure.
Yeah. The other thing too, I noticed on one of your end slides, there was a comment there about Avon and Somerset and training. And I was curious to know, obviously some of this research that you've spoken about today is very recent. What sort of inroads have you made in terms of being able to get authorities to implement training specific to interviewing people with autism?
Well, in the UK, you've got 43 police forces, and there's not a joined up approach, unfortunately. So some forces are really on it, and other forces really not. So Greater Manchester Police, they're very good actually. Hampshire and Avon and Somerset have all they've all been very open to talking about what they can do differently regarding autism, and that's ranging through from first response and all the way through their processes. Avon and Somerset, though, they're the only ones at the moment who have role specific training. So we've been working, because they're our local force, so we've been working together to deliver that. Most of them that do have autism training, it tends to be the generic, like, this is what autism is, and occasionally you might get an autistic person rolled out and go, here's an autistic person, which is better than nothing. But yeah, it's still not ideal for actually, getting to change the way they're actually, practicing. So I think having that role specific element is really important, and also it being driven by autistic people as well. So I work quite closely with an autistic police officer actually in developing this and delivering this training. So
yeah, that's fantastic. And I think as somebody has said to me in the past, if you meet one autistic person, you've met one autistic person, and the differences between them are really extensive. So the research format that we often use to study interviewing responses tends to make us think about the uniformity between people, but in fact, when we're interviewing, we very much have to deal with a unique individual that we're presented with, which you made reference to yourself. So, well, look, are there any other comments that you'd like to make, Katie? Just to wrap up, I think that was a fantastic and very informative session.
Thank you very much. I think I've covered everything that I wanted to say. Thank you. Thanks everyone for listening in a different time.
All right. Thanks very much, Katie.
All right. Thank you.